Tolman. He's also the executive director of Right on Crime. Gentlemen, welcome in today.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. Jesse, first to you, since you are on the Trump team, Todd Blanche, John Lauro there. Usually it'd be to stave off a filing, but if they're told to expect it, what could the strategy be right now? And do you think, with the grand jury also convened, that we are imminently looking at this happening today?
Well, I don't know if it's going to happen today or not, but the one thing that I think is very, very clear is that Special Counsel Jack Smith is absolutely hellbent on getting Donald Trump. He wants to bring an indictment in Washington, D.C., because he's afraid that Donald Trump could get a fair trial in Florida on the charges he's brought in Florida. The case that he has outlined in D.C. is completely legally and factually baseless. Everything that, for instance, on January 6th, President Trump said to his supporters that they should peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. That's not something you can charge somebody for a crime with. Contesting elections is something that is inherent in our democracy. Trying to charge someone with a crime for challenging an election is an attack on our democracy. And so I will say that no matter what we see from Jack Smith, and when we see it, these are going to be legally and baseless, factually baseless claims. And I'm confident that the American people are going to see it for what it is, an attempt for Jack Smith to decide who the next president of the United States is, and not the American people.
Yeah, Jesse, President Trump that day did say what you mentioned. He talked about marching peacefully, patriotically, making their voices heard, marching to the Capitol. The one thing, though, the Democrats have pointed to, and the January 6th committee, and I'm wondering your take on this, and also Brett, he did say we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So clearly, is it likely they're going to basically construe this and use this as part of those potential charges that we saw in the Target letter? What do you think, Jesse? And then, Brett, I want to bring you in.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has been very clear that language like that is not something that is actionable. There's a very famous case called the Brandenburg case that has made it very clear that that's not actionable. In fact, politicians all the time talk about fighting. And what they're talking about is the American people going out, and this is, I think, especially President Trump here, and letting their politicians know that the American people will not stand for, whether it's election fraud, whether, for instance, our borders being open, whatever it might be, that we've got to fight for our rights as Americans. It's preposterous to suggest that in any way encourages violence. Fighting, saying that you're supposed to have to fight, is perhaps one of the most common phrases in American politics.
And Brett, as you know, so this is a grand jury. They don't have to be unanimous, and they also don't hear anything from the defense. So kind of walk us through the process here. It's also a D.C. grand jury. Give us your thoughts on where we are today and what you're hearing from the Trump's attorneys being there, and also, dovetailing off of Jesse saying, what could these charges actually entail?
Yeah, Bianca, John, thanks for having me on. Look, here's where we're at. Less than 1% of all federal grand juries fail to bring an indictment when presented. It tells you how easy it is to spin your case and present it to the grand jury and secure an indictment. Unfortunately, the public seems to believe that once you have an indictment, that it justifies the criminal action that is being brought by the prosecutors. And nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is he does have an obligation to put in front of the grand jury exculpatory evidence as well, which I doubt that he will. There's not a member of the defense team that's in there. There's not a judge that's in front of the grand jury. Ultimately, there will be justice, I believe, in this case and in others. But I think Jack Smith, if he were confident in his case in Florida, he wouldn't be bringing this at this point. He could do it at a later time. You would only do this if you are instead concerned about politics and most concerned about trying to eliminate Donald Trump as a candidate.
Hey, Brett, as Logan was talking about, we don't know everyone who's been interviewed in this potential indictment. There's been talk that perhaps Mark Meadows is among those who've been interviewed. Chris Christie said the other day that Mark Meadows, when he was asked by a reporter about January 6th, said, I can't say anything about January 6th, indicating potentially that there was some kind of cooperation. Would you agree with that? What's your take on that?
Well, the government's going to try to make any witness believe that they're obligated to not talk about what happened in the grand jury. That's not true. The only one that is governed by the secrecy rules is the government and the agents investigating the case. I'd like to see folks that get called into front of the grand jury try to expose and reveal what's going on in there. I think the American people, especially in this case, should be very interested in the fact that DOJ is compromising their internal policies. They've long held that they would not bring cases that would ultimately interfere in an election. You've heard Comey and others talk about the sanctity of that rule. Well, that rule is thrown out the window when it's a candidate that they don't like. And so it's hard to watch those exceptions and hypocrisy of the Department of Justice go forward when I know there was a time that they would have expended as much energy, if not more, to expose the obvious corruption in the Biden family and that conspiracy ring than they would a candidate who appears to be asking his followers to peacefully protest, but to continue to fight for the election integrity. I mean, that's free speech in this country. It always has been. If we were going to prosecute that, there's a lot of candidates on both sides of the aisles that we historically would have prosecuted.
And a candidate who's now leading on the GOP side for the primary, at least. Brett Tolman, Jesse Benal, gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll continue to check back in, obviously, as news warrants here throughout the day in D.C. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, guys.